What is up, my Plata people? Welcome back to the Periaki My channel, where we are wrapping up this series, the Answering LDS Truth Claims series, where we have been responding to Brett McDonald's LDS Truth Claims. Uh, this is it. We have arrived at the end of this journey. All that stands before us is just a final evaluation of the arguments, and this is going to end up being pretty rapid fire because we have so much ground to cover. So if you want more justification for my positions on these issues, just go back to the relevant episodes. Let's get this party started. For argument one, McDonald concludes by saying, quote, "No naturalistic explanation can account for any person's ability to produce these ideas. Further, no naturalistic explanation can reasonably account for someone of Joseph's time, place, education, and life circumstances to produce these ideas. Therefore, it is reasonable that he received revelation as claimed. If Joseph received these texts and information from a supernatural source as claimed, it is reasonable to believe that his claims regarding the existence and origin of the metal plates. Therefore, it is reasonable, probable, that Joseph Smith in fact possessed plates weighing between 40 to 60 pounds, of which the Book of Mormon is a functional translation as claimed." Now, we will get into the issues with this inclusion at the relevant time. I just wanted to mark this here, as it is what we are ultimately aiming toward in this argument. It's a long argument, so it's worth remembering where our journey leads. I do want to nudge a bit at this idea of whether it is reasonable to conclude that Joseph possessed plates on the basis of his claims receiving information from a supernatural source are true. I'm not convinced yet that this is necessarily the case. However, I also believe that it is irrelevant to the ultimate outcome of this analysis. So let's get started. Premise A. At least 14 informal witnesses claim that he/she/they felt plates weighing between 40 to 60 pounds, lifted the plates, or were shown plates by angels. In general, we can accept this premise as true. There were about 14 informal witnesses who each claimed at least some part of the experience described. However, the strength of these statements is rather weak for the nature of the claim. When it comes to witness claims about supernatural events, it is worth remembering things such as the miracle of the sun in Fatima, Portugal. Most of us would probably conclude the witnesses were mistaken in what they saw, motivated by some degree of religious fervor. Others of us may accept that the witnesses saw what they saw, but their interpretation of the events, namely that it was a manifestation of the power of Mary, is not correct. My treatment of these witnesses and their statements is not any different from how I treat the witnesses of the miracle of the sun. Premise B. Many non-converts and non-friends tried to steal or bargain for the plates. This premise would render the conclusion a non sequitur. It sure seems like a red herring fallacy. In all, it is just a whole lot of so what. Did any of these people actually see the plates, or did they just think that Joseph may have had some treasure that he wasn't letting them in on? McDonald does nothing to suggest that some people thinking that the plates may have been real is actually any good evidence for their reality. Premise C. Martin Harris's half-long testimony of the angel and plates is reliable from the Martin Harris proposition. What we get in the entire Martin Harris proposition is that Martin Harris was convinced of a thing. It does little to establish the reality of the plates. Also, considering Martin Harris as reliable is problematic, and we'll get into this a little bit more as we discuss the other witnesses, but being reliable for a claim or credible for a certain claim is relative to the nature of the claim. Premise D. Oliver Cowdery's testimony of the angels and plates, as well as receipt of divine authority and 3 separate visions, are reliable from the Oliver Cowdery proposition. When we discussed the Oliver Cowdery proposition, we interrogated this term reliability a bit, discussing whether or not the claims attributed to Oliver could be reliably discerned on the basis of eyewitness testimony. My conclusion was that these claims are not reliably discerned as true on the basis of witness testimony. Therefore, we cannot conclude that Oliver Cowdery's testimony is reliable. Cowdery is an interesting character, but I really enjoyed how Skousen described him in his interview with on Mormonism with the Murph. Good comedy for sure. A person may be considered reliable or credible for a certain type of claim and not for others. If I claim to have a dog, I'm probably pretty credible just by virtue of being a human person and the ownership of a dog being a fairly mundane thing. If I claim to own a dragon, however, then no matter how honest I may seem otherwise, I am not credible for the nature of that claim. Premise E. David Whitmer's testimony of the angel and plates is reliable from the David Whitmer proposition. During our review of the David Whitmer proposition, we noted that there were some interesting discrepancies in his accounts of seeing the plates that align with legendary embellishment, rather than the usual apologetic claim of tailoring a different message for a different audience. Whitmer has a propensity for that sort of behavior. At the time when most of his statements were collected, he was also incentivized to promote himself and his position in the early restoration. we can actually pretty effectively use McDonald's own criteria for impeaching a witness when it comes to David Whitmer. Premise F. 8 men testified of seeing, lifting, and inspecting the plates, and their testimonies are reliable. Again, McDonald undercuts the strength of his own argument by including these appeals to reliability. The relationship of the 8 to Joseph and David Whitmer is a critical biasing factor that has to be accounted for in evaluating their reliability. It is a major source of bias, and because of the nature of historical inquiry, we are left with few to no tools to really interrogate those biases. Premise G. There is no direct evidence against the proposed fact that Joseph possessed plates of ancient design and received divine authority. Here we get a major so what. Direct evidence is not necessarily good evidence. What would direct evidence against the claim that Joseph possessed plates of ancient design even look like? How would one go about providing direct evidence against the idea that Joseph received divine authority? I saw Joseph Smith not in possession of divine authority. Yeah, it should be apparent why this premise is just pointless peacocking. The inclusion of this premise was also a warning of things to come for this series. Premise H. Direct evidence, witnesses, and circumstantial evidence, original printers' manuscripts, corroborate Joseph's Book of Mormon origin story. We found that in the sense that the Book of Mormon is the product of an oral dictation to a scribe, this premise is true. In the sense that it leads to the conclusion that there were actual plates, that really doesn't necessarily follow from this premise. McDonald has fixed the issue with this being a true red herring, which was the issue that I focused on in the episode dealing with this premise, though. Premise I. Critical theories of Book of Mormon origins lack evidence and contradict each other in why, how, and who. And when this came up, we accepted that some theories do lack evidence and that some do contradict each other. However, we pointed out that there are examples that build on each other, and many of the examples of contradictions that McDonald presented were spurious and showed a lack of imagination on his part. However, even if there were no good critical arguments, that would not mean it is reasonable to conclude that Joseph Smith possessed plates. I don't have a good critical explanation for how L. Ron Hubbard discovered the idea of Thetans and Xenu, but that does not mean that I think he got those ideas from anything other than his brain. Premise J. Evidence is strong for a literal equivalence translation of Book of Mormon names, and at least 15 non-biblical Book of Mormon names are now attested in ancient Hebrew inscriptions, 14 of which date to before 587 BCE. None of these were known or published in Joseph Smith's day. The Book of Mormon also contains 4 authentic Egyptian names. No naturalistic explanation can reasonably account for these correspondences. The idea that no naturalistic explanation can reasonably account for these correspondences is one that McDonald will return to a lot. It's also total crap. Ignore it when it comes up. He doesn't like the naturalistic explanations that do account for these correspondences, which range from parallelomania to apologists fitting square pegs into round holes to, yeah, sometimes when you throw a bunch of stuff out there, a few things stick. Was Joseph trying to come up with Hebrew names? In many of these cases, it's unclear. It would also conflict with McDonald's own ideas about how the language of the Nephites is changing and evolving to fit more into this Mesoamerican context. It all amounts to attempting to have his cake and eat it too. Premise K. It's a long one. The beginning of the Book of Mormon is consistent with the culture and situation in Jerusalem in about 600 BCE. It fits in the context in at least the following. Migration from northern kingdom of Lehi's ancestors in the land of inheritance separate from the home in Jerusalem, Egyptian influence writing during the time of peak Egyptian influence, Lehi is one of many documented prophets sent to Jerusalem, unbelief that Jerusalem could be destroyed, Lehi preaching against some of Josiah's reforms, Lehi preaching against the removal of original temple tradition, teaching of atoning Messiah, Nephi understanding the tree as woman due to Asherah worship, tree of life as ancient wisdom symbolism intact and almost certainly as it was in 600 BC, Lehi's vision has the iron rod guiding people to the great tree, the older and probably the original understanding of the word, complaints of corruption, removal of scripture, plain precious things, Melchizedek priesthood extant 600 BCE, Lehi is a fleeing prophet. No naturalistic explanation can reasonably account for these correspondences. This is probably the first premise where it really is a go back and watch the video covering this for more detail. There is a lot that went into the assessment of this premise. This section was rife with argumentum ad Barker, and as with every other time the no naturalistic explanation refrain has come up and will come up in this series, yes, there are all sorts of naturalistic explanations. McDonald just doesn't like any of them. It's also worth noting that the episode here for Premise K and the episode for Premise L are among my favorites in the series. Premise L. The part of the Book of Mormon covering the Lehi Exodus in Arabia is consistent in geography and culture in at least the following. The 3 recorded occasions of Lehi offering sacrifices when measured against sacrificial law in the Bible become immediately understandable in light of the family situation. The frankincense trail from Dophar, the ancient source of that precious material, to near Jerusalem. The trail conforms in detail to Joseph Smith's account of distances, turns, and specific geography. Maintenance and working of bows. Nahum is a name and a date and a place and a turn in the ancient frankincense trail, and a specific relationship to another location, bountiful. Affliction in the empty quarter, bountiful in Arabia, matching all required elements, ore, mountain, cliffs, fruit, honey, timber, etc. No naturalistic explanation can reasonably account for these correspondences. Again, this is a video to go back to. What I agreed with is that this represented the single best external evidence for the Book of Mormon's historicity. That conclusion on my part was vindicated by the rest of McDonald's presentation, frankly. However, the claims made by McDonald go beyond what the text actually supports. There's the Book of Mormon that exists, and there's the Book of Mormon that McDonald wants to exist, as evidenced by his arguments. And these are two very different texts. Simply put, the claims made in this premise are not supported by the text of the Book of Mormon itself and must be read into through an apologetic lens. Premise M. The Book of Mormon's description of geography and topography corresponds to an actual geography and topography in Mesoamerica, including geological conditions required for events recorded in 3rd Nephi, metals and gems, over 600 other multiply dependent correspondences, and no naturalistic explanation can reasonably account for these correspondences. All right, so for this premise, I primarily pointed to the many competing hypotheses that contradict McDonald's own. I argue that these competing models suggest a vagueness to the text of the Book of Mormon that allows the reader to impose a geographic model onto the text independent of the author's actual intended setting. Thus, rather than this being something a naturalistic explanation would struggle to account for, this sort of fitting is easily explained by noting that the text is sufficiently non-specific to permit highly motivated apologists to fit whatever they feel is best onto the text. Premise N, another long one. The Book of Mormon's description of populations, literacy, and culture corresponds with Mesoamerican chronology and culture in at least the following. Jaredites and Olmec overlap in time, depth, and geography in an area north of the proposed Nephite lands. Nephites and Maya overlap in time, depth, and geography. Both Olmec and Maya were literate cultures. There are remnants of the Olmec culture surviving and overlapping for the appropriate centuries with the Nephite cultures. Desire to elevate Nephi to king reflects cultural trends discerned for Mesoamerican peoples during that time frame. Jacob's sermons discussing the twin evils of costly apparel and polygamy fits into the economic pressures that were beginning during that time period in that region. The movement of the Kitchean speakers into Kamanelahuyu corresponds in time depth to the change in circumstances that led to Mosiah fleeing the city of Nephi. The merger of Nephites and the people of Zarahemla corresponds in time and place with the linguistic movement of the Zokis speakers into the Grijalva River Valley. King Benjamin's denials correspond with Mayan kingship. The system of overkingship and interstate visits corresponds with Mesoamerican political systems, the treatment of captives, the anti-Nephi Lehis, and the cult of war. The expedition Limhi sent to Zarahemla that gets lost following the wrong river and finds remains. The use of cement and treelessness of the Teotihuacan area north of the Nephite lands. The historical influence of the powerful city-state of Teotihuacan provides the explanatory background for the changes that Mormon notes in the nature of warfare and the destruction of the Nephites. No naturalistic explanation can reasonably account for these correspondences. This was the point in the series where my confidence in McDonald really started to crumble. Rather than feeling like I was engaging with the best of what good faith apologetics for the LDS position had to say, I found myself dealing with just frankly apologetic garbage. This was just an attempt to throw the spaghetti against the wall and hope that something would stick to salvage a model that's just absolutely broken. No naturalistic explanation is even needed to account for these correspondences because the correspondences are so weak as to be laughable. Premise O. Despite the fact that Joseph Smith lived in the age of modern or technical warfare, the Book of Mormon consistently reflects the basic patterns of pre-modern warfare, as well as ancient Mesoamerican warfare in the following. The pre-modern and Mesoamerican military patterns described in the Book of Mormon are not limited to generalities, but also extend to the minutest detail of the text. The causes of warfare, agricultural, economic base, the problems of supplying soldiers in times of war, seasonal patterns of warfare, military implications of geography and climate, limited use of animal resources, armor, weapons technology and typology, fortifications. No naturalistic explanation can reasonably account for these correspondences. And honestly, just see premise N and my response there. This premise does no better than the last one. Premise P, a fun one. After publishing the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith claimed to reveal a part of the prophecy of Enoch. In at least the following 22 themes and specifics, Joseph Smith's Enoch corresponds to Enochic literature not available to the world in 1830. Enoch is lad. Enoch's call occurring while on a journey. Open your mouth, divine protection, turning of rivers, Gibberim equals giants, wars, bloodshed, secret oaths, the wild man, Mahijah name, Mahijah role. Enoch's homeland, righteous, book of remembrance, great fear in listeners, conceived in sin, hope, war, wild beast roar, prison for unrepentant, weeping Enoch, God weeping, Enoch initiated. No naturalistic explanation can account for these correspondences. Therefore, it is reasonable, probable, that Joseph Smith received revelation from a non-earthly source, God, as he claimed, the Enoch proposition. All right, so to deal with this premise, I propose the Enoch counter proposition, and I'm showing that here. After publishing the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith claimed to reveal part of the prophecy of Enoch, and at least the following themes and specific details. Joseph Smith's Enoch corresponds to the KJV, 19th century American Protestantism, and Joseph's own dictated or revealed texts. Moses 6:33 and Joshua 24:15. Moses 6:35 and the anointing of clay to the eyes in John. Moses 6:35 and 36 and seership. Moses 6:37 and Lehi and Samuel the Lamanite. Moses 6:39 and Abinadi. Enoch and Nephi as young prophets trained by their fathers about the Lord. Moses 6:44 and try to Isaiah. Moses 6:48 and 2 Nephi 2:25 shows the Book of Mormon was definitely written first. Moses 6:49 and Mosiah 16:3-4 shows that the Book of Mormon was definitely written first. Moses 6:52 and the name of Jesus Christ shown to Enoch. Moses 6:54 and 55 and the original guilt and sin. Moses 6:55 and 66 and Doctrine and Covenants 29:39 suggests that Enoch was not written until after September of 1830. Moses 6:57 and 59 and no unclean thing references in the Book of Mormon. Enoch's concept of being born again. Moses 6:61 through 68 with the New Testament Book of Mormon themes not found in the Enochic literature. Enoch's vision in Moses 7:1-11 and Nephi's visions. Blackness and despised. Angelic themes less esoteric in Joseph's Enoch than the Enochic literature. Moses 7:33 and New Testament language with Book of Mormon ideas. Endless and eternal. Moses 7:39 and Enoch's anachronistic awareness of Moses 4:1-2. Moses 7:46-47 and post-John Christology. Moses 7:50-68 absent Enochic themes with abundant New Testament and Book of Mormon themes. These correspondences are all consistent with what would be expected if Joseph Smith was the original author of the Enoch passages in the text identified as the Book of Moses. No consistent, non-fallacious apologetic argument can account for these correspondences. Therefore, it is reasonable, probable, that Joseph Smith is the original author of the Enoch passages without any need to appeal to a divine intervention or direction. The Enoch counterproposition. For one, the Enoch proposition has 22 themes, but the Enoch counterproposition has 23, and that automatically makes it better, as is known. In more seriousness, where the Enoch proposition relies on single-word or high-level thematic similarities between Joseph's Enoch and the rest of the Enochic literature, the Enoch counterproposition goes with much more detailed and lower-level thematic similarities. McDonald complains that critics have not engaged with Joseph's Enoch. Well, McDonald, here you go. Premise Q. In 1842, Joseph Smith published portions of a Book of Abraham, and at least the following, the Book of Abraham's unique and unknown in 1842 information about Abraham is corroborated by ancient texts. 1. The very existence of a written record by Abraham. The Bible provides no hint that a Book of Abraham ever existed. 2. Abraham's obvious literacy in his possession of ancient records. 3. Abraham's desire to be one who possesses great knowledge. 4. The rebellion of his fathers, who had once received the priesthood but turned to idol worship according to Egyptian practices. 5. The practice of human sacrifice, including the sacrifice of children as part of the practice of local idolaters in Chaldea. 6. The killing of people who refused to worship idols of wood or stone. 7. The violent seizing of Abraham by local priests to slay Abraham, also as a human sacrifice. 8. The role of Terah, Abraham's father, in seeking to have Abraham killed. 9. The miraculous delivery of Abraham from death by the power of God, who sent an angel to free Abraham after Abraham cried to the Lord. 10. The repentance of Terah, Abraham's father, and his subsequent return to idolatry after the famine abated. 11. Abraham's knowledge of stars, planets, and astronomy obtained through revelation. 12. Abraham teaching astronomy in Egypt. 13. Revelation to Abraham about the premortal existence of spirits or intelligences in the presence of God, including information on a great council in heaven where plans were established for this earth or our mortal trial here. 14. Abraham honored by kings or on a throne. No naturalistic explanation can reasonably account for these correspondences. Okay, so there exists like 13 hours of Dr. Robert Rittner, the sort of person who can clear the hurdles that McDonald tries to impose through Nibley and Gee, on being allowed to engage with Book of Abraham criticism, presenting a reasonable naturalistic explanation that deals with pretty much all of what's presented here. There's also a lack of evidence that any of the 14 things listed in this premise comport with reality, largely because Abraham is a literary figure, not a historical one. If a historical Abraham existed, he was almost certainly not at all like the figure described in Genesis. Premise R. In 1842, Joseph Smith introduced the endowment. He claimed that this endowment was ancient, specifically that it was had by the ancient patriarchs, and by Jesus. Evidence exists in ancient texts for at least the following specific endowment themes and discrete symbolic actions, images, or phrases. 1. The tradition originates with Jesus. 2. The initiatory rituals are the center of Christ's gospel. 3. Pre-existence of mankind and creation drama. 4. Washing and anointing with oil. 5. Ritual prayer circles. 6. Use of ritual clothing. 7. Hand clasps as tokens of recognition and hands in cupping shape to receive. 8. Sacred signs, tokens, and keywords, including knowledge of the sacred name of God, is necessary for exaltation. 9. Sacred marriage to complete the ordinance. 10. in the initiation rituals symbolize a heavenly ascent, and the veil separates the initiate from God. No naturalistic explanation can no naturalistic re- no naturalistic explanation can reasonably account for these correspondences. I've said that phrase so many damn times at this point that it's just getting hard to say. What McDonald actually presented to support this is that humans do stuff, and some of that stuff is part of the endowment. Isn't that amazing? Plenty of naturalistic explanations exist for this, perhaps even more so than for the Book of Mormon, but McDonald demonstrated in this part that he had little regard for what critics actually had to say, presenting like just egregious strawman arguments. Premise S. Evidence from the Book of Mormon, Book of Enoch, Book of Abraham, and the endowment corroborating Joseph's claims do not have a reasonable naturalistic explanation, therefore it is reasonable that Joseph received these texts/information from a supernatural source as he claimed. If Joseph received these texts and information from a supernatural source as claimed, it is reasonable to believe his claims regarding the existence and origin of the metal plates. And this premise just falls flat on its face, laughably so at this point. Apart from the fact that naturalistic explanations for the individual components of these arguments were provided throughout the series, the idea that it would be reasonable to assume supernatural source simply because naturalistic explanations are inadequate is fallacious reasoning. McDonald has not even demonstrated that a supernatural explanation is even possible, let alone reasonable to ever conclude. With that said, why would we accept the supernatural claim given? How could we possibly know that it isn't just like teenage prankster aliens who deceived Joseph Smith as part of like a party dare? This is the problem with supernatural claims. Once you consider them a reasonable conclusion, you have to have a mechanism for actually showing what is and what is not a reasonable supernatural conclusion to draw. Personal discomfort with a claim is not sufficient. The remaining premises will fall under this super premise. Joseph's revelations solve, in many respects, centuries-old philosophical and Christian-specific problems and are consistent with the earliest forms of Christianity, provide guidance on the abiding anxieties of life, and in many cases, traditional theology is moving closer to Joseph's theology. Specifically, premise T, Joseph Smith's theology dissolves the question of nihilism and the threat of non-being. This one gave me a good chuckle. Also, I mean, if you accept Joseph Smith's theology as true, then sure, nihilism is false. However, we have now a bit of a circularity issue in accepting this premise. This premise is actually a good case example of how this whole super premise is deficient, because there is no objectively true theology, no standard of true theology we can actually reliably point to evaluate the restoration against. This whole super premise is little more than intellectual masturbation. Sure, Joseph did a thing, and it's interesting, but so what? How does that prove he had gold plates? Of course, does not. Premise U, Joseph Smith's theology resolves the paradox of creation created by classical theism. Sure, but it introduces another problem of infinite regress, which the paradoxes of creation created by classical theism help to contain. I don't really care if one wants to insert that there is an infinite regress, but Christian apologists like William Lane Craig really don't like them. Premise V, Joseph Smith's theology of material spirit and body requiring each other for full selfhood resolves the mind-body problem. It does resolve the mind-body problem if you accept this answer to the mind-body problem. Demonstrate that a material spirit exists, if you please. Premise W, belief in divine embodiment did in fact exist and persist among the faithful followers of Christ from Christianity's earliest beginnings into the 5th century CE. Joseph Smith's embodied God restores the original Christian understanding. Now, Joseph was tapping into something that many early Christians would have believed, but his post-Enlightenment ideas would also have been completely foreign to the original Christian understanding. It's just unnecessary overreach on McDonald's part here. Premise X, Joseph Smith revealed a passable and personal God that was drastically different than the then accepted God of Christianity. More than a century later, this view of God has now been reaccepted by virtually all of Christianity. Again, this is overreach on McDonald's part. A lot of Christians are emphasizing seeking a personal relationship with God while also holding that God is without parts or passions. I'm not saying that it makes sense, but McDonald is reaching way beyond what is actually happening in modern Christianity. Premise Y. It is the accepted view of virtually every scholar who has reviewed the evidence at length that the doctrine of creation ex nihilo is a philosophical innovation at the end of the 2nd century CE. Joseph Smith's revealed theology of creation ex materia restores the original Christian understanding of creation. If McDonald could just quit while he is ahead, he would actually be able to make a good point. He just seems unable to help himself. Joseph did present an idea of creation ex materia that is, in broad thematic terms, similar to how the first generation of Christians would have understood the creation story. The devil is in the details, as they say. Once we scratch beneath that very high-level surface understanding, we realize that what Joseph restored has very little to do with the original Christian understanding. Premise Z, or Z for my Canadian viewers. By denying creation ex nihilo, Joseph Smith's theology obliterates the central Christological dispute. This premise is framed as though disputes around Christology are a consequence of the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, and that represents a bit of a misunderstanding of the Christological debates and how they developed. We see evidence of the Christological debates in the Gospels themselves, while the interplay with philosophical ideas that would result in the doctrine of creation ex nihilo certainly played a role in later Christological debates. Premise Y of this very argument shows that the doctrine itself could not have been the central factor in the Christological debates that preceded the end of the 2nd century CE. Premise AA. Joseph Smith revealed a Godhead, social trinity, that was drastically different than the then accepted trinity of Western Christianity. This view of the Trinity is the accepted pre-creedal view and has now been accepted by thinkers representing every major Christian tradition. Sweet. And what if the true God is actually Lisa the rainbow giraffe, leaf be upon her? This does nothing to suggest that Joseph Smith had gold plates. Premise BB. Joseph Smith defined perfect as unchanging in some respects, love, miracles, sympathy, and eternally self-surpassing in other respects, creations, relationship creating. This definition of perfection and view of God was radically different than the God and definition of perfection of classical theism. However, in the 20th century, philosophers have argued that there is magnificent intellectual content far surpassing that of such systems as Thomism implicit in such a conception. Thus, to many, Joseph's definition of perfection is more intellectually rigorous and has more philosophical power than classical theism. Joseph Smith said a thing that is different from classical theism, therefore ancient Hebrew Americans wrote on gold plates in Reformed Egyptian, which Joseph translated through divination. The silly becomes obnoxious at this point. Premise CC. Joseph Smith's theology speaks directly to that need in many Christians for the development of the feminine image of God. It places the divine feminine on the same ontological footing as Heavenly Father and requires man and woman for deification. But you're not allowed to know anything about Heavenly Mother, pray to her, or anything like that, nor can women hold the priesthood. Also, none of this remotely suggests that Joseph had gold plates. Premise DD. Joseph Smith claimed to reveal a doctrine of deification that was met throughout the years with calls of heresy, pantheism, and philosophical unsoundness. However, in the past 60 years, the early Christian doctrine of deification has been reaccepted by every branch of Western Christianity. And, I mean, it hasn't been accepted by every branch of Western Christianity. That's just, I mean, where did he even get that from? But even accepting the premise as true, so what? Premise EE. Joseph Smith was heavily criticized for rejecting a closed canon. However, in the last 50 years, scholars are arguing that it is difficult biblically and theologically to argue for a closed canon. I agree with McDonald about this premise, but I do not agree with its place in this argument. Ellen White also received revelations. Joseph was not doing anything unique, even for the time period. Premise FF. Joseph Smith's theology of postmortem evangelization and vicarious baptism dissolves the soteriological problem of evil. Double F is the grade that I would give to this argument, though as noted in the episode covering this premise, the soteriological problem of evil is, in fact, resolved by Joseph's ideas regarding vicarious baptism. A little hiccup for the conclusion, Joseph was obviously personally interested in this topic. It is unsurprising that he would come up with a solution that would allow Alvin to be saved. Premise GG. As recorded by Joseph F. Smith, Doctrine and Covenants 138 represents a remarkably condensed amalgamation of the three versions of the descent of Christ into Hades. Cool. Joseph Smith said some things that are interesting. Therefore, Joseph Smith had gold plates. Is that what's going on here? This is just weird. This, mind-bogglingly weird. Premise HH. When Joseph Smith revealed postmortem evangelization, no Christian community accepted the doctrine, and it had laid dormant for more than 1,000 years. However, it is now agreed upon that the earliest Christians taught the idea, and within the last century, more and more biblical commentators are affirming that Christ did indeed preach the gospel to disembodied spirits who had the choice of accepting his message. 1 Corinthians 15:29. We all know this verse. That is honestly enough of a naturalistic explanation for this idea. When paired up with 1 Peter 3:18-20 and Joseph Smith's own ideas to have a post-mortem pathway to salvation, this is a rather unsurprising idea. Or rather, it is easy to give a naturalistic explanation for where this idea could have come from. Premise II. There is evidence, biblical and post-biblical, that some of the earliest Christians practiced vicarious baptisms for the dead, at least until the early 5th century. Again, 1 Corinthians 15:29. I mean, the idea that the practice persisted into the 5th century is an interesting one, but let's be honest, the century that the practice persisted into is not the important part here. Premise JJ. Joseph Smith's theology dissolves the logical problem of evil, the most pervasive and powerful argument against the existence of a loving God. Joseph's theology allows a Christian to trust and worship God in full confidence, and he is doing all that can be done, given the nature of things, to help us overcome evil as we progress in the struggle with it. So Joseph Smith presents the soul-making theodicy and the free will defense. These might be good answers to the basic form of the logical problem of evil, but they fail to handle the problem of natural evil or the problem of natural suffering, essentially the evidential problem of evil. Also, the problem of divine hiddenness and outgrowth of the problem of evil is a significant challenge for LDS truth claims. And really, for more on that, check out my conversation with Leo Winiger over on Colby Reddish's Let's Disagree channel. Premise KK. Joseph Smith's revelations provide unique insight into the atonement. 1. Unlike in classical theism, God is not the source of the alienation between man and God. 2. The problem that requires Jesus' sacrifice is inherent within each human soul, and therefore there is no other way. 3. The resolution of alienation requires our response to Jesus' free act of love. 4. At least one Mormon concept of atonement is similar to the earliest moral influence idea, and assuming you don't believe in creation ex nihilo prior to 200 CE might actually be the same, with the important addition of understanding why the atonement is absolutely necessary. It is not necessary because of some eternal structure of justice in the universe outside of us, which demands payment from us for our sins, nor of some similar structure within the nature of God itself. The atonement is absolutely necessary because of the nature of intelligences, a nature that is self-existent, not the creation of God, and is therefore uniquely impervious to metaphysical coercion. McDonald just asserts here that the atonement was necessary because of the nature of intelligences. However, that just moves the problem up one step. Instead of asking why justice or why God would require a blood sacrifice, we instead ask why do intelligences require a blood sacrifice? No matter what aspect of the cosmos is requiring a blood sacrifice for the forgiveness of wrongdoing, the idea of the atonement will face this same challenge. It is also challenged when looked at through the lens of how the idea of the atonement developed in the first place. The Messiah of the Old Testament does not play any role in atoning for the sins of the world. The law was considered sufficient for this function, with God himself saying as much. However, when Jesus failed to fulfill any of the messianic prophecies contained in the Old Testament, his followers were left with two choices: move on or try to make it work despite the failure. In this case, the followers of Jesus of Nazareth managed to get something going with the idea of his death and resurrection and promised return. All of these ideas appeared in other contemporary movements. Even Nero was thought to have resurrected. The Christian movement then altered the prophecies and transformed many of the non-prophecies into prophecies of the Old Testament to build a narrative around the idea of the Messiah atoning for the sins of the world. This concept is most clearly articulated in the Gospel of John, though the writings of Paul show that this was an early strategy for coping with the shock of Jesus' death. In other words, atonement theory only exists because Jesus failed to fulfill messianic prophecy, and the theory itself rests on a rather nonsensical framework of God requiring blood sacrifice to forgive sin. Going back to the argument, no naturalistic explanation can account for any person's ability to produce these ideas. Further, no naturalistic explanation can reasonably account for someone of Joseph's time, place, education, and life circumstances to produce these ideas. Therefore, it is reasonable that he received revelation as claimed. If Joseph received these texts and information from a supernatural source as claimed, it is reasonable to believe his claims regarding the existence and origin of the metal plates. Therefore, it is probable, that Joseph Smith in fact possessed plates weighing between 40 and 60 pounds, of which the Book of Mormon is a functional translation as claimed. When we get back to the conclusion, after a review of all the premises, we see that there are naturalistic explanations. Even in the absence of naturalistic explanations, a supernatural explanation would not be justified. It is, under McDonald's own argument, therefore not reasonable to conclude that Joseph received revelation from a God which exists in reality. We can therefore consider it unreasonable and improbable that Joseph possessed golden plates weighing between 40 and 60 pounds, of which the Book of Mormon is a functional translation. Argument 1 is fallacious. It has all sorts of unsupported premises, and therefore its conclusions are rejected. Now, most of the premises that constitute argument 2 are found in argument 1. Therefore, many of the same problems that affect argument 1 affect argument 2. Having found argument 1 fallacious, unsupported, and therefore rejected, it is hard to imagine a different outcome for argument 2. What argument 2 does is that it tries to lean into the improbability of Joseph Smith pulling off this whole endeavor. And to offer a bit of an olive branch to this point, the success of the restoration is quite improbable. In fact, in correspondence with others, I have described early Mormonism as just a series of low probability events. Most religious movements like this flicker and die pretty quickly, especially after the leader dies. If the leader dies without a clear plan of succession, the chances that the movement survives are even worse. So it may seem like we could take all the issues of argument 1 and at least say, but sure, isn't it just too improbable that this movement became what it has if some supernatural force was not behind it? However, that's just really not how good probabilistic reasoning actually works. Just because a low probability event happens, it does not mean that something supernatural is going on. Low probability events happen all the time. In Joseph Smith's era, there was a whole religious fervor that produced a ton of religious movements. Some succeeded, Others dwindled, and others still have experienced a metamorphosis that produced a whole bunch of offshoots. Just look at how many modern Christian movements trace back to the Millerites. What are the chances that a movement like Scientology would have survived as long as it has? How many breakoffs of Jewish monotheism have there been? And why is Islam such a massive example? If we extend beyond Christian and even Abrahamic traditions, look at like Buddhism and how it grew out of Hinduism and early Hindu ideas into a religious tradition that spans much of South and East Asia with all sorts of diversity in its variants. Or how about just like how like Shintoism has been preserved through the millennia? This may result in some criticism, but I'm just not going to go through argument 2 with the same like premise by premise like detail that I did with argument 1. For what it's worth, all of the arguments which are materially unique to argument 2 receive full treatment in their respective episodes. The balance is already dealt with in argument 1. Argument 2 is fallacious. It is invalid and unsound. It is therefore rejected. And that's going to bring to a certain like overall conclusion here. Brett McDonald was trying to establish that it was reasonable on the basis of the premises presented to conclude that Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon from golden plates. I am not here to say that it is unreasonable to believe that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is true, or to accept that the Book of Mormon is true, or anything like that. You may have good reasons for doing that. However, those reasons are not in this argument. If you have come to the conclusion that the Book of Mormon is true on the basis of the argument presented by Brett McDonald, you have done so unreasonably. It cannot be reasonably concluded that the Book of Mormon is true on the basis of such an unsound and invalid argument. Brett McDonald has failed to meet a reasonableness standard. He's failed to meet a preponderance standard. But ultimately, that brings us to the end of this series, of the Answering LDS Truth Claim series. I want to thank you for sticking with me through all of it, and I do apologize again for the long hiatus in the middle. Unfortunately, just kind of given my life circumstances at the time, there was no way I would have reached the end of this project without that hiatus. So a few other like closing notes. If Brett McDonald is open to a long form discussion on certain key issues, I would be like more than happy. I'd be over the moon to engage with him on that. And I think that maybe like Mormonism with the Murph would be a good platform where we both kind of would feel comfortable and safe to engage with each other in good faith. And this is, of course, assuming that the Murph is willing to host, and of course, assuming that Brett McDonald would even have an interest in doing that. Some of you have expressed interest in that, and this is sort of a formal announcement of interest in doing that. However, I completely understand if Brett's not willing to do that. Totally fine. Brett may not even hear about this series overall. Totally fine. I'm not really expecting anything. Just know that the interest is there. But if this is the end of sort of like directly engaging with Brett McDonald's work, thank you for coming along with the ride. I don't expect that the believers in my audience will ultimately agree with the conclusions that I've drawn per se, but I at least hope that you have a sense of why a non-believer finds like that LDS Truth Claim series to be like other than a compelling case for the truth value of the restoration movement. And that really was the aim of my response series, was to evaluate critically that series and maybe to show why a critic may not find it so compelling, so reasonable. That's going to do it. Thank you all so much for watching this series. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, do all of the fun YouTube things, and I will catch you in whatever comes next. Later.